The envelope wasn't addressed to me. That's the first thing I noticed when the hospital's head accountant, Mrs. Patricia Holt, slid it across her desk with 2 fingers, like it was something she didn't want to touch. Dr. Tran, Mercer, she said quietly, her voice barely above the hum of the hospital's ventilation system. I think you need to see what's inside, but please, don't mention this to anyone until you do. I stared at that manila envelope the way you stare at an X-ray when you already suspect what you're about to see. 3 weeks after my wedding, I thought I had everything. A career I'd spent a decade building. A husband I believed was my safe place. A future that felt, for the first time in my life, steady. But when I pulled out those documents, that future cracked right down the middle. There it was. My name. My medical license number. My DEA registration. On 17 procurement invoices I had never signed. Mrs. Holt folded her hands on the desk. Someone's been using your credentials to authorize pharmaceutical orders. The amounts are significant. I flagged it last week. I wanted to come to you first before I involved compliance. I looked up at her. Why come to me first? She met my eyes. Because I've worked with you for 4 years, and whatever this is, Dr. K. Mercer, it didn't come from you. I drove home from Atlanta General that evening without remembering a single red light. The ring on my left hand felt strange, like I was wearing something borrowed. My husband, James, was finishing a late call when I walked in, his feet propped on the coffee table, laughing easily into his phone. He waved at me without looking up. I went straight to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the counter staring at our wedding photo on the refrigerator. The 2 of us under the white oak trees at Seren Bay, his arm around my waist, my face tipped up toward his. I looked so certain in that photo. I set the glass down slowly. My mother's voice came to me from memory, something she'd said on the morning I matched into my surgical residency. Claire, the hardest thing about being a doctor isn't what happens in the OR. It's learning to trust your diagnosis even when you don't want it to be right. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark listening to James breathe beside me, steady and unbothered, while my mind ran through every possibility the way I run through a differential before a difficult surgery. Systematic. Methodical. One by one. By 2 in the morning, I had eliminated the ones that didn't fit. By 3, I was on my laptop, pulling up the hospital's internal procurement portal with my administrator login. I cross-referenced every invoice Mrs. Holt had flagged against my actual schedule. The dates on the forged authorizations matched days I had been on shift, but the orders had been placed from an access point outside the hospital network. An external login, routed through a VPN registered to a consulting LLC. I searched the company name, Mercer Hale Solutions. Mercer, my last name. Hale, my best friend's last name. Sophie Hale and I had been inseparable since the first week of medical school at Emory. We'd studied together, cried together, celebrated every match and milestone together. She had been my maid of honor 6 weeks ago. She had straightened my veil and told me James was the luckiest man alive. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. The next morning I went for a run through Piedmont Park. The Atlanta skyline was soft in the early haze, the kind of quiet that only exists before the city wakes up. I ran hard, longer than usual, until the only thing I could hear was my own breath. When I finally slowed at the pond, I stood there watching the water and thought about my father. He'd been a small-town family doctor in Dalton for 32 years. The kind who made house calls and never sent a bill to a family he knew couldn't pay. He passed 4 years ago, but he left me something I carried every day. His old stethoscope and a note written in his handwriting on a prescription pad. The diagnosis is only the beginning, Claire Bear. What you do with it is the whole story. I hadn't cried yet. I wasn't ready to. When I got home, James was still asleep. I showered, changed into my civvies, and drove to the address registered to Mercer Hale Solutions. It took me 20 minutes and a real estate search to find it. A mailbox service in Buckhead. A shell address. The kind used by people who need a paper trail without a real location. My stomach turned the way it does when a patient's labs come back worse than I expected. That afternoon, I stopped by my mother's house in Decatur. She was on the back porch reading, her silver hair pinned up, a mug of sweet tea on the table beside her. She looked at me over her reading glasses with that particular stillness she has, the kind that means she already knows something is wrong. "You've got that look," she said. "What look?" "The one you had when you were 12 and you'd already figured out what was in your Christmas presents but didn't want to ruin it." She set her book down. "Sit." I sat. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I told her I was working through something at the hospital. She reached over and put her hand over mine. "Whatever it is," she said, "you didn't get this far by looking away from hard things." I drove home with her words settling into my chest like a slow breath. That evening, I opened the shared Google Drive that Sophie and I had used for wedding planning. Color swatches, vendor contacts, timeline spreadsheets, 2 years of friendship folded into folders. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I found it. A subfolder named Logistics that had no wedding content in it at all. Inside were shared documents between Sophie and a financial advisor named Derek Whitfield, account transfers, billing code lists, a spreadsheet mapping my DEA number against a schedule of order windows. The earliest entry was dated 9 months before my wedding. I leaned back from my screen, eyes burning, and thought about a night 6 months ago when Sophie had asked me, casually over dinner, how the hospital's new procurement system worked. I had explained it to her in detail, the authorization codes, the credential verification process, the external access portal for consulting physicians. I had thought she was just curious. She worked in healthcare consulting after all. It had seemed like a natural question. I had handed her the blueprint, and she had built something with it. Betrayal, I was learning, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives in the spaces between normal moments, in a casual dinner question, in a bridesmaid standing close enough to zip your dress. The next morning, I went back to Mrs. Holt before my shift. I brought everything I'd found: screenshots, the company registration, the drive documents. She looked at each one carefully, then looked at me. "Dr. Mercer," she said, "this is beyond internal compliance. This is federal. Pharmaceutical fraud at this level involves the DEA and potentially the OIG." "I know," I said. "Once I escalate it," I said. She paused. "Your husband's name isn't anywhere in this, but your friend's is. I know that too." I walked out of her office and stood in the hospital corridor for a moment, the morning rush of nurses and residents moving around me. I pressed my father's stethoscope to my chest through my scrubs, a habit I'd had since he gave it to me. I could feel my own heartbeat, steady and quiet. That evening, James came home to find me at the dining table with a glass of wine and a calm expression I'd had to practice in the bathroom mirror. He kissed my cheek, asked about my day, and started talking about a real estate opportunity he and his business partner were considering. I asked questions. I listened carefully. He was relaxed, easy in the way of someone who doesn't know the ground has shifted. After dinner, while he was in the study, I picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. In the inner pocket was a business card. Derek Whitfield. Whitfield Capital Strategies. The same Derek Whitfield from Sophie's financial documents. I took a photo and put the card back. I sat in the kitchen alone after James went to sleep, my father's stethoscope on the table in front of me and the prescription note beside it. The diagnosis is only the beginning. What you do with it is the whole story. I read it 3 times, then I folded it carefully and put it back in my pocket. I wasn't angry, or at least the anger had gone somewhere deeper and quieter. What I felt instead was clarity, the kind that comes in the hour when everything else falls away and there is only the work and the next right move and the one after that. 2 days later, I got a call from Special Agent Dana Reyes of the DEA's Atlanta field office. Mrs. Holt had moved fast. Agent Reyes was direct, professional, her voice carrying the particular efficiency of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by very little. She wanted to meet. We sat across from each other in a conference room at the Federal Building downtown. She laid out what they already knew. The Mercer Hale Shell Company was one node in a broader pharmaceutical diversion network, small enough to avoid early detection, structured to move controlled substances through fraudulent authorization chains. The investigation had been building for months before my name appeared in it. My credentials had been used as cover. "Your husband," Agent Reyes said carefully, "has a documented relationship with Derek Whitfield that we're still characterizing." I didn't blink. "What do you need from me?" She looked at me for a long moment. "We need access to the inside of the relationship between Whitfield and your friend Sophie Hale. You're the only person they both trust." I thought about my father, about what it means to do the hard thing when the diagnosis is clear. "Tell me what to do," I said. The setup took a week. Agent Reyes's team was methodical. A staged dinner at a restaurant downtown, private room, the kind of setting that feels like a reconciliation. My role was to invite Sophie for what she would understand as an attempt to smooth over a growing distance between us. I hadn't returned her calls in 2 weeks. She would be eager to repair things. Guilty people usually are. I got ready in the bathroom that evening the way I get ready before a long surgery, deliberate, unhurried. I put on the green dress James always said looked elegant. I was not elegant, I was focused. James had been told by his attorney in a conversation I was not part of but had been briefed on, that a voluntary cooperation agreement was available to him. He arrived at the restaurant before Sophie did. When he saw me, something in his face shifted, a brief softening, like he was about to say something real for the first time in a long time. "Rachel, Claire," I said. He stopped. "My name is Claire. Use it." Sophie arrived 7 minutes later in a camel coat, her smile wide and carefully maintained. She hugged me at the door, held on a beat too long. "I've missed you," she said. "I feel like we've barely talked since the wedding." "I know," I said. "That's why I wanted tonight." We sat. "That's why I wanted tonight." The server brought water. The room was warm, the lighting amber, the kind of atmosphere designed to make people comfortable enough to say things they shouldn't. Agent Reyes's team was next door. The table had been prepared. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing. Her work, my schedule, the honeymoon James and I had taken to Asheville. Sophie was good. She was warm and present and entirely convincing. I had known her for 9 years. I had watched her do this her whole life, wrapped people in her attention so completely they never thought to look at her hands. I waited until the appetizers arrived. "I've been going through some of the hospital paperwork," I said, keeping my voice light. "Routine stuff. But I found something strange. My credentials showing up in systems I don't have any memory of authorizing." Sophie's smile stayed in place. "That sounds like a headache. IT issues?" "Possibly," I said, "but the access point traces back to a consulting company, Mercer Hale Solutions." I paused. Funny name, right? A stillness moved through her. Just a fraction, the kind you only catch if you've spent years learning to read what a body does when a mind is recalibrating. James set his fork down. "Sophie," I said, "I'm not here to perform. I'm here because I need the truth. All of it." She looked at James. He looked at the table. "Claire," she started, "how long have you been using my license?" The silence stretched. The restaurant sounds filtered in from outside, silverware, low laughter, the ordinary world continuing. "It wasn't supposed to touch you," Sophie said finally, her voice quieter now. "That was always the whole point. The credentials were just the layer. No one was ever supposed to trace it to you personally." "But they did," I said, "because you used my name. Derek said it would be clean." "Derek," James said suddenly, his voice hollow, "told me it was a legal gray area, a consulting arrangement. I didn't know what Sophie was doing with." "Stop." I looked at him. "Don't make me choose which version of this is worse." He went quiet. "You," I said to Sophie. You stood next to me and zipped up my dress. You gave a toast about friendship and honesty and how you'd always have my back. My voice was steady. I had practiced this steadiness. And the whole time you were building something on my name? Sophie's eyes filled. I was in trouble, Claire. The consulting firm was failing. Derek came to me with a solution, and it was supposed to be temporary. And then it just kept going. I said, yes, for 9 months before my wedding. She didn't answer. Keep talking, I said quietly, and she did. James did. They filled the silence the way people do when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long. Relief and self-justification tangled together, each sentence a small additional admission. The room recorded everything. Agent Reyes's voice came through my earpiece, barely a breath. We have it. 2 more minutes. I looked at the 2 people I had trusted most in my adult life and felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage, not satisfaction. Something closer to grief. The clean, clarifying kind that tells you a chapter is finished. Thank you, I said, for finally telling the truth. The door opened. 2 federal agents entered with the particular quiet authority of people who don't need to perform what they carry. Sophie went very still. James stood up involuntarily, knocking his water glass. Sophie Hale. Agent Reyes said, "You're being taken into federal custody in connection with pharmaceutical fraud and identity theft. Mr. Mercer, you're advised to contact your attorney." Sophie looked at me, her face stripped of everything practiced. "You set this up?" "No," I said. "You set it up. 9 months ago. I just followed the diagnosis. They led them out through the side entrance. The room was quiet after that. The half-eaten appetizers still on the table. The candle still burning. Agent Reyes came in and sat across from me. "You did well," she said. "Cleaner than most." "I'm a surgeon," I said. "I'm used to working in small spaces without making a mess." She almost smiled. "What happens now is going to take time. You understand that." "I know. And your name is cleared. Mrs. Zone. Holt's documentation and tonight's recording will close that chapter completely." I nodded. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip and looked at the candle. I drove to my mother's house afterward, even though it was past 10. She opened the door before I knocked, as if she'd been listening for my car. She looked at my face for a moment, then stepped aside to let me in. "Sit," she said. I sat at the kitchen table, and she made chamomile tea without asking and set it in front of me and sat across from me and waited. I told her everything. Start to finish, no abridgments. She listened the way she has always listened, completely, without interrupting, without fixing her expression into something reassuring before I was done. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have said you handled that exactly right." "I keep wondering if I should have seen it sooner," I said. "You saw it when you needed to." She reached across the table. The diagnosis was right. The treatment was right. The outcome, she squeezed my hand, is still being written. I slept in my old room that night, the one with the yellow curtains and the shelf of medical textbooks I'd had since high school. It was the first full night of sleep I'd had in 3 weeks. In the weeks that followed, James moved out by mutual agreement. Our attorneys handled the logistics. We didn't fight over furniture. There was nothing theatrical about the end of it, no shouting, no dramatic declarations. Just 2 people acknowledging that something built on a crooked foundation can't be restored by goodwill alone. I filed papers on a Tuesday morning before my shift, came home that evening, and made a quiet dinner for one. I called my mother every day. She asked about my cases, not about the proceedings. Sophie's case moved into the federal system. Derek Whitfield was indicted on 7 counts. James received a deferred prosecution agreement in exchange for full cooperation. I was listed in the documentation as the victim of credential fraud and the cooperating witness whose testimony had been central to the case. I never had to appear in court. The recording did the work. 6 months after that evening in the restaurant, I was asked to present at a medical ethics conference in Nashville, a panel on physician identity protection and institutional fraud prevention. I almost declined. Then I thought about all the residents and young attendings who would be in that room. People just starting to trust the systems they worked inside, and I said yes. I stood at the podium in the conference room and looked out at the rows of faces. I'm going to tell you something they don't cover in medical school, I said. Your credentials are not just professional property. They are your identity, and the people most likely to misuse them are not strangers. The room was very still. I learned this the hard way, I said. And I'm standing here because I decided that what happened to me would not be the end of my story. It would be the part that made the next chapter matter. After the session, a young woman came up to me, a second-year resident, barely older than I had been when Sophie and I first met. She had the same look I recognized from mirrors, the look of someone trying to understand how to be strong in a profession that takes everything you give and asks for more. How do you forgive someone like that? She asked. Someone who was supposed to be your person? I thought about my father's stethoscope, which I had in my bag. I thought about the prescription note I still carried in my wallet. I thought about my mother's kitchen table. You don't forgive for their benefit, I said. You forgive because carrying someone else's choices inside you is the slowest kind of damage there is. And you're a doctor. You know what slow damage does. She nodded, her eyes bright. After the conference, I took a long walk along the Cumberland River, the Nashville skyline catching the afternoon light. An older woman sat on a bench near the waterfront, watching the water with the specific contentment of someone who had long since made peace with the current. She glanced at my conference badge. Doctor? She said. Yes, ma'am. She smiled. Good. We need more of you who still look like they mean it. I laughed, a real one, the kind that surprises you. That evening, I called my mother from my hotel room. How was it? She asked. Good, I said. Good, I said. And I meant it, really good. Told you. You always tell me. And I'm always right. I could hear her smiling. Come home Sunday. I'll make your father's cornbread. Copy that, I said. A month after Nashville, I drove out to Dalton on a Sunday morning to visit my father's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the Georgia pines throwing long shadows across the headstones. I crouched down and put my hand on the stone the way I always do, just to feel something solid. Hey, Dad, I said. I finished the hard part. The wind moved through the trees slowly. I know you'd tell me I was supposed to figure this out faster, that I should have seen the warning signs. I paused. But you also used to say that a good doctor doesn't blame themselves for a patient's choices. They just make sure they do right by the truth. I set two things at the base of the headstone, a small stone from the Cumberland River and a printout of the conference program with my name on the speakers list. I'm still practicing, I said, like you always told me to. Back in Atlanta, I returned to the hospital on Monday morning the way I always do. Early light, the smell of antiseptic and industrial coffee, the particular purposeful hum of a building full of people trying to save something. Mrs. Zeeley. Holt waved at me from across the lobby. I waved back. In the locker room, I changed into my scrubs and clipped my badge and looped my father's stethoscope around my neck. I stood at the mirror for a moment before heading to rounds. I didn't look like someone who had been through something. Or maybe I did, and that was the point. Scars are just the evidence that something was worth fighting through. I walked out into the corridor and let the morning take over. A patient in Bay 4, waiting, a consult in 6, a resident who needed guidance, a day full of the ordinary, extraordinary work of keeping people alive. That was enough. That was more than enough. If this story found you at a moment when the truth felt like too much to carry, I hope you'll remember this. The diagnosis is never the end. What you do with it is the whole story. And if you've ever had to rebuild from a betrayal you never saw coming, share it below. Someone out there is still learning how to stand back up. They need to know it's possible.